Hello, everyone. Welcome to the January 23rd edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting at MakerDAO. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development here. We are going to talk mostly about risk in today's call. We have lots of issues that we need to touch on these things. Governance is not easy. Coordination is not easy. Communication, understanding what it is. What kind of a world we're carving out is enormously complex. And last week we had a great call that sort of was a perfect example of that, where we were addressing an enormous amount of issues. Most of those were focused on governance. And so I want to pass the mic to Risk in this call and start talking about some of the things that we have on the go there. That's another enormously complicated world. We have migration on the go. We have some significant issues, which we probably won't be addressing in this call, but we should start addressing in more depth in the future. We're at this point where this machine that we've built, this governance machine, is now beginning to. I'm casting around for analogies here. Maybe it'll come to me in a second. It's starting to work very effectively. Is the analogy I was trying to get to. So we've set up a communication channel in this call. We set up channels in Rocket, and we set up mechanisms, or we set up a forum. People like LongForWisdom and Sam and numerous others have stepped up to work within that framework and build out guidelines and signaling methodologies and have these deep discussions about when polls start and when polls ends, and how we pull the levers that we have available to us. A perfect example of that is Sam's heroic effort to get DSR spread up and running, which has been great for us. But we're starting to reach a certain level of momentum where there's a fantastic amount of things happening in the forum. There's lots of activity, lots of things on the go. And these calls are going to become far more targeted towards addressing those initiatives and iterating on them and trying to figure out how we can make sure that the rubber hits the road. That's the analogy I was looking for. There we go. I got there eventually. So we have to figure out how the rubber meets the road, and take all these initiatives and plans and proposals that are showing up in the forums and get them on chain, basically. And there's going to be a lot of work ahead of us. So we need to figure out how to alternate between those two worlds of risk and governance, and eventually make sure that this machine that's controlling the rubber is running at a fever pitch. But for today's call, let's talk about risk for a bit. But before we do, I am going to not forget that LongForWisdom exists, even though he's one of the most important people in my life. And I'm going to hand it off to him to give us a brief recap of governance at a glance.
Yeah, cool. All right, so there's been a number of threads this week. We've got, so I think probably one of the most active discussions last week has been the one where Seth Benton from SourceCred has presented some information about the SourceCred algorithm and how it could help us compensate workers if we decide we want to do that. So there's also a discussion going on there, like people discussing the pros and cons of this algorithm.
I find, sorry, LongForWisdom, I know that you
Good, yeah.
were slightly alarmed about how unprepared you were today, so I'm just going
to
twist the knife a bit. Can you give us like a brief? This is absolutely fascinating, right? Like, this is a big thing. So we have problems in governance. We have civil issues. We have participation issues. Well, not we. Everybody does. But I think that we're actually one of the shining examples of a governance system that actually works. And so those problems are nice problems to have. But can you give us a brief recap, just like the general broad strokes of what reputation and governance and how those two things align?
I can try to. So I guess I'll describe it like SourceCred, because I think that's probably a better way of framing it. Like, so SourceCred is, from what I understand, is an algorithm based on the Google PageRank algorithm. So what powers like web search essentially, and the way that works is that sites that are linked to by more sites are have higher rep, and those sites, when they link to other sites, those sites that high rep flows through that edge to that new node. So it's kind of like an algorithm for I guess, distributing reputation within a community. And again, this becomes potentially useful for governance because we have a problem where the governance overhead is starting to become quite high and looks to only get higher as we go forwards. And if we want people to continue to engage at the level that we might start requiring them to, then those people are going to require some sort of incentivization. And this is a possible solution to that, I guess.
I think
Sure. That how do they gain that incentivization though? Like, what is their reward here? So oh, actually, yes. Do you have an answer for that? Do you know?
What's the question? What's the reward?
So you said it's sort of an incentivization mechanism, or creates a reward for people for engaging in the system.
So it can be used for that, right? So it creates like a reputation system where it essentially ranks users by their contribution, and you can then use that ranking as an input to a compensation. Right?
Yeah, I guess that's interesting. Maybe I just have like this mental model because you said reputation as a reward system, but the reputation itself is the reward. So I think that it's an enormously complicated subject, right? Because we want people to engage in the system, so potentially the more people are engaged, the higher their reputation becomes. However, that's measured, and therefore, it becomes like a weighting system. Like, this person is obviously highly engaged, and they've done a lot of things, and so maybe I should read this proposal more seriously than I would have done otherwise, or maybe allocate some additional time.
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah, Sir, go ahead.
So I've done quite a bit of research in source cred. So from my understanding, it's basically like a toolbox to have a reputation weighted peer review system of communities or distributed teams. And they basically run a modified version of PageRank, like you mentioned. And it's on like a contribution graph to produce like cred attribution. So basically source cred individual members of the community can earn reputation defined specifically by the community or community leaders, and they'd get compensated for the value they bring to the system in that way. So it lowers the barrier of entry into the community and encourages high quality work. Now, the biggest question there is seeing the contributions in quantity versus the quality of it.
Yeah, precisely, because you're creating it's the same thing it falls into the same general bucket of let's incentivize voting somehow. And then the question becomes, are people here to make good decisions for this and secure the system and stabilize the peg, or are they here to make 50 cents to vote each time they vote, right? So how do you separate those two? And that's a conversation we have a lot in these calls, like how do we increase participation? And sort of this lurking question in the back of my mind is participation really, is that our primary goal, participation? Like, do we need to, once we have 1,000 people voting every week, is that in itself a good thing? Or is that just one of 100 different data points to figure out whether we have healthy governance or not? And the reputation thing too, it makes me nervous. Like, it's fraught with peril. It's kind of like crypto in a way, where either it can be a tool for freedom and autonomy and self-agency, or it's the greatest dystopian record-keeping mechanism ever devised by man. And when you combine a blockchain with reputation, I get slightly nervous about what the implications of that might be. Particularly, so what happens, some genius comes along, goes, oh, this is interesting, look what MakerDAO's up to, let me just fix all of their problems. Oh, but I can't get in because I don't have a badge and enough points. That kind of stuff makes me super nervous.
I think the quality of the contributions is a really important thing to consider, because source cred thing is kind of like just one piece of the puzzle, as I think everybody in that thread kind of beat on towards the end. It could be a good maybe measure of a person's engagement in our community over time. Like if you could see that they've been contributing like somewhat regularly for like a year, this person probably deserves some more reputation than the guy that has 3 or 4 contributions only in the last few weeks. So it's just one piece of the puzzle. That's how I was seeing it. But I think
I agree. Like, it would have to be just another data point, right? Not the not the criteria for whether somebody gets to vote or they come into the system, or are they taken seriously or not.
But so something that I wanted to point out is that in the forum, something that I really like and that I've been seeing is that we have like owners of Signal request threads rekindle new threads, or even like something Derek did last week. He summarized all of the sort of the whole point around single collateral DAI global settlement. He made a thread and tried to take all of the points that he saw in the forum and all the points that he knew himself as somebody who's working at the foundation, and he created a thread. So I think that kind of behavior from like top contributors and owners of threads is going to be really important as we get more volume of contributors and people talking on the threads.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I agree. And but there's things that I'm concerned about too. And so here's the flip side. There's lots of different types of people in the world, and not everybody is concerned with reputation or online points or what people think about them or anything else. And sometimes those people are enormously valuable, and waiting. Obviously, like we've said, or you pointed out, that like this is not going to be the criteria potentially for people to engage in the system, just yet another data point. But I don't know. I go back and forth on like what the value of that data point would even be. But it's an interesting thing to think about. But the other thing that I'm concerned about too is that, well, it's a pre-filtering and incentivization, and there's all kinds of things tied up into reputation. One of them is the corollary of that is, do we want to particularly incentivize people that are driven by this sort of gamification of reputation? Like, is that necessarily a quality that's good governance requires? These are all super complicated questions. I love it though. It's something we're gonna have to figure out. Like, reputation is a thing that's missing, right? We don't have identity on the blockchain, so we need something that's a shorthand for that. Until we do, or unless that happens, reputation is something that fills that gap. But the problem is that reputation can be gamed, it can be optimized for, it can be abused, it can be bought and sold. There's all kinds of problems.
And it can be inspiring.
Sure.
help produce some of the good work, you know.
It can also be kind of fun, right? ETH Trader has this donuts thing, not ETH Finance.
Yeah, that's a perfect example, because we saw.
Yeah.
Oh God, no.
Yeah, no, it's cool. I'll pollute the thread with that idea, but like actually thinking it through, so you can evaluate it as an example where it's more meant to be fun, but people can actually, they did code it. Well, no, they destroyed it before they actually deployed the token. So now there actually is a token on Ethereum. You can trade it. It's on Uniswap. So,
yeah. Well, I think that was like a good example of how it could be fun before it almost destroys you. So,
goes terribly.
Actually, Cyrus is in the call. Maybe he wants to apologize publicly for this. Cyrus? Tell us what you did.
So I had nothing to do with the tokenized version of it, but I am the inventor of the meme, of the donut meme.
Cyrus. You took something beautiful and pure like ETH Trader, and you ruined it. How dare you? Actually, it was a cesspool anyway, so who cares? All right. Yeah, Cyrus, think about what you did, please. All right. We should.
There's some stuff going on in the chat. Do you want me to just really quickly?
Yeah, actually, that's something I want to talk about too, because this has been happening more and more over these calls. Is that we seem to be having two different calls going on. One is the chat call, and one is the people talking call. And I want to try and move those things back into one again. So if there's interesting things happening in the chat, let me know, please.
Yeah, Meme Lord. It started off with Meme Lord asking for gasless voting, and then it was just a brief conversation about how that's possible. And then Sam mentioned the low-hanging fruit of improving the load time of the governance votes. And yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, those are both two very interesting discussions. And the gasless thing ties into incentivization, or at least reducing of friction too, which is an interesting discussion. And we have developers here, and maybe they can talk about this or even inform us if there's movement heading in any of those directions. I'm reasonably sure that I've been involved in discussions about leveraging relayers to actually smooth the process and potentially cover gas or subsidize gas in our ecosystem. I'm not entirely sure where those discussions landed. Nobody's speaking up, and maybe there's no new information there. But one of the things, so here's my counterpoint to that. Well, actually, I don't know if that is a counterpoint. Is that a friction? Like, would somebody say, okay, well, I feel strongly about this ecosystem, but I'm not going to vote because it cost me 50 cents?
So my point to this was that if you vote at one way, it costs you less than a cent. So you can vote like 4 times a week for an entire year for like $2.50.
Yeah. For me, it's not so much the cost. It's sort of like there's a lot of synchronous waiting. Like you have every week, you have to go back, wait like 10 to 20 seconds per vote for it to load, then wait on the blockchain, stuff like that. So just any way to make that quicker, I think would help.
Yeah, we certainly have some UX stuff to address. Like, and I feel your pain because I think that I'm probably the one who's clicking on that thing the most. And I have mechanisms where I just open up 5 different windows and go do something else and wait for the polls to load in the background and come back later. So obviously we have some issues. I don't know if there's anybody from the product team. Chris B had mentioned in the chat that there were initiatives afoot to work on a caching layer for the portal to speed that thing up a bit, but I'm not sure where that progress is.
Yeah, Rich. So we've got it on the backlog. I've just got to see and look at what else we've got to prioritize in that space, because there's a few different things that we can look at with regards to UI UX components and how we speed it all up, which could also include a redesign of the governance app as well. So there's a bunch of things we need to pull together into a roadmap, and that, as Sam has mentioned, is definitely one of them.
Is that something that you'll be soliciting the community for, or bringing the results of that roadmap back to us?
Yeah, definitely. At the moment, all I have is a list of items, and that's part of the discussion of, okay, where do we want to focus on? And I'm happy to share that with everyone, absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think that this group here is probably the primary stakeholders when it comes to interacting with that thing. So it'd be great to get some input from this group.
Cool.
All right. I think that we might be hitting the edge of our philosophical segment of the call. Let's pick this up again at the end of the hour for the general Q&A, and then we can talk about some of our outstanding issues. But I really want to get into the numbers and the graphs. Sorry, so I'm going to hand this off to you.
Shall I finish governance at a glance first? Or?
I forgot you existed again. There he is. Much the most important person in the world to me. Oh yeah, there he is.
So that was discussion number 1.
Oh no. All right.
Okay, no. So yeah. So other threads this week. So I said Planet X described some of the governance overhead in Maker and how it's set to increase, which I kind of mentioned already. But there was some discussion around that, and he shared some diagrams which were quite cool, quite grim in some ways, in the expansion of work. So I'll see how that pans out. We also had another thread where Adam was asking about how exactly executive votes work. This kind of popped up a couple of times, It's something maybe we need to work on better about informing people, because when there's some sort of when anybody new joins the community, they sort of find out about executive voting and then think they understand it, and then they realize later on that they didn't understand it, and later figure out how it works. So at some point we need to have possibly these already exist, but we need a place to refer people to explain spells and casting spells and the hat and
yeah, definitely. Well, David, we have onboarding guides too, right? So we have something in there.
We have a basic onboarding guide, but it's not a technical explanation of how the chief works, for example. But you can go on docs.makerdao/smart-contract-modules/governance-module. And you could totally read about all the technical details. But
something we should consider, though, it'd be nice to have a plain English explanation of exactly what continuous approval voting is in the Q&As.
Well, we have that in the governance FAQ, and a refreshed version of the governance FAQ should be coming out very, very soon. Me and LongForWisdom are currently working on it.
Cool.
All right, so getting on into signal requests. So we've got the signal request from Maitote about whether we should have a treasury to manage revenue, and that's kind of continuing. I'm not sure what the plan is for that going forward, so maybe to get some clarity on that. So then we've got the so I guess most people know this, but like I'll say it anyway, the signal request for changing the DSR governance poll to a DSR spread governance poll has passed and is now being used. So that's pretty cool. Congrats to Sam for getting that through.
Actually, I want to jump in there. Sorry, even though I forgot that you were talking. Now I'm going to interrupt you. There's an interesting. The DSR spread is super interesting because it. Well, for all kinds, I'm not going to go over it again. Everybody here should know why that's interesting. The thing that we haven't discussed yet, though, is the implications of whether if this thing works or not. Then what do we do? Because part B, I guess, of this, and Sam, feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this sort of frees us up from the pain and heartache of having to do this poll every week, right? So it's entirely possible that the DSR spread allows us to begin thinking about how often the DSR spread needs to be voted or polled on for, right? So, Sam, do you have some thoughts about that? Or is this just something we're going to figure out over the course of the next month or two, whether we need to keep on doing this weekly or is there
Yeah, so I was just planning on having it run weekly for a bit, and then I figured this would happen. It would like it's like 99.5% consensus on 0.25%. So it's a pretty clear signal to me that like everybody wants the DSR to follow the stability fee. At least that's how I'm interpreting it. So yeah, I was just planning on letting that run for a few weeks, and if it kind of keeps up, then yeah, I think we can probably reduce the frequency.
All right, cool. I'll look forward to maybe you can shepherd that or surface that discussion in a couple of weeks after we get some clarity.
Rich, are you going to add 0% to the poll next week?
Yeah, so here's the mea culpa. I messed the poll up this week. I forgot. I was thinking that we were in a relative world and not an absolute world, and so I didn't put the 0 in. My mistake. 0 will be there next week. Thanks for bringing that up, Cyrus.
No problem.
Cool. Okay, so last couple of signals. So the handling executive bundling in relation to technical changes, I believe that's going on chain this week, right? Or this on Monday. Rich, do you want to just confirm that again?
Yes, I will again confirm that it's going on this Monday. Sorry, LongForWisdom.
No, it's fine. Cool. So summary. So yeah, what's this one? Oh yeah, so the SED shutdown summary and discussion of parameters, that's still up. I think we're not entirely sure what the plan going forward with this is. I think Aaron is going to try and coalesce that into some sort of on-chain poll or like a final poll. But I guess currently we've at a stage where we've summarized that but haven't moved forward yet. So I guess look out for that in the future. I think that's everything, Rich. So you can feel free to pass it to Risk.
All right. Thanks, LongForWisdom. Lots to think about. People should be checking the forum. There's 2 or 3 extremely, well, let's just call it one for now that I'm thinking of the top of my head. This the global shutdown, emergency shutdown. Well, let's just call it shutdown, so we don't need to do this anymore. The shutdown poll or proposal is in the forums. This requires deep thought and deep insight. It's going to be one of the, after, I don't know how you want to rank it, but after the launch of MCD, this is going to be like maybe the second biggest thing the ecosystem does. So let's think about this very carefully. People have opinions. They want to know how the protocol is going to shake out. They need to be familiar with plans around the shutdown of SCD. So please review that forum thread and speak your mind.
Actually,
right.
Sorry, one more thing I just want to say about that. I think there's some questions about whether on the use of the tax parameter that we still need to clear up. So I think hopefully we'll get a signal request about the tax. No.
Yeah, there's some
Makes sense. It
mechanical
looks like around that.
issues. There's governance issues, and there's also risk issues. There's developer issues, and so there's lots of issues involved with that. So we need to. That's you're right. So great. Thanks for bringing that up. So that would be like the third most important thing that's going to be happening in the ecosystem in the next 6 months. So please dig into those discussion threads, shutdown, and the issues around what do we do with outstanding fees in a shutdown scenario in SED.
That's the only real blocker, because I think it crystallized around what would be a healthy supply to shut down around, and also a healthy time, more or less. So I think the last real piece of the puzzle is figuring out the game theory for the remaining CDP owners.
Yeah, and when it comes to game theory, nothing is easy. So yeah, please, everybody, dig into that. All right, Cyrus, if it's okay with LongForWisdom, I will hand it off to you.
Okay. Lots of interesting changes in monetary policy. Size stability fee went up to 9% last week, and looks like this week it's voted up to the MCD ETH stability fee is 8%, and I guess so that means the DSR will be 7.75%. Right. I'll let Vishesh. Vishesh is going to talk about some statistics, and then Primoz will present some stuff after. We can talk about it after that. Looks like Vishesh is not on the call. Did he drop out? No, he's there.
If somebody doesn't start talking, my head's going to explode.
Yeah, yeah, your mic's not working, Vishesh.
Can Primoz go first, like, while we're waiting?
Let's. Okay, yeah.
Okay. Just a sec. Okay. So last week we saw a pretty heavy migration flow. We also crossed the 100 million DAI mark. About 8 million SAI was migrated, but the DAI supply actually increased for about 12 million, which means additional 4 million DAI was minted in a week. We also saw SAI inventory starting to accumulate last week. At one point, there was about 6 million SAI deposited. And then actually the second largest SCD CDP used it for repayment of its debt, which was at about 5 million. This particular CDP that migrated used this high liquidity was actually the one I showed last week. If you remember when I said there's one CDP doing most of the SAI minting during the migration, and I said that probably these CDPs are going to be the last ones to migrate. Now the whole theory was kind of destroyed. It seems this CDP changed its mind. Could also got worried because of potential tax implementation or limited SAI liquidity we were actually debating about last week. This week I prepared some stats for MakerDAO, which are not all related to migration. Some of them are, but I thought that they might be useful for MakerDAO governance. The material that I'm going to show next was prepared for Spencer Noon's newsletter called Our Network. I suggest you subscribe to it because I'm regularly contributing MakerDAO metrics and as I said, those metrics should be valuable for MakerDAO governance. So the first insight was trying to compare DAI lending across secondary lending platforms and comparing it also with DSR. Now we know that with the introduction of DSR, the landscape for lending became much more competitive. MakerDAO actually overtook the #1 spot from Compound, and this was also because Compound implemented DSR. So all of the unutilized DAI at Compound goes now into DSR, and that's why I counted in DSR this value. The market share significantly decreased for DYDX. There's the red line here. DYDX had almost 13 million DAI supplied in the middle of the summer. Now it has only, I think, less than 3 million. Compound at all-time high, they had 40 million DAI supplied from lenders. Now they have a bit below 20 million DAI that are supplied. So the market share of secondary platforms is decreasing. And that's mainly because MakerDAO now has DSR. And it's also because MakerDAO before couldn't, actually the secondary lenders could easily compete with MakerDAO, because if you think about it, they could easily middle it, right? The stability fee at MakerDAO was 20%. There was no DSR, so the effective spread was actually 20%, and secondary lenders could easily just middle it, and that's why we saw, 13% yield being possible during the summer to be achieved at those platforms. The black line, the dotted one, actually shows total deposits, so it includes DSR as well versus total supply. You can see that we're not actually at all-time high currently, although DAI deposits, DAI lending is at all-time high, and that could be actually partially explained by the fact that there are still a lot of size supply that's pretty much unutilized on lending markets, right? Those lending markets are pretty much dead, and this could be the all-time high reached in the summer is also explained by this 13% yield, right? Even though the yield currently looks okay, you shouldn't forget that during the summer you could achieve 13% yield on secondary lending platforms, and that's why a lot of DAI was actually supplied and deposited from these savers. The second graph shows just the other side of the market, so the outstanding DAI loans. Of course, MakerDAO was always, the biggest one because it presents all of the supply. But it's also interesting to see how the market shares of Compound and DYDX decreased significantly. Again, for DYDX, the borrowing measures only about 2.3 million. At all-time high, it is about 10 million. So about 80% decrease as well on borrowing side at DYDX. Compound, again, close to 50% decrease of borrowers there. And again, this high market share of MakerDAO, actually increased market share of MakerDAO, is again consequence of low fees that MakerDAO is currently offering, and more specifically low spread that MakerDAO is offering currently, and secondary lenders cannot really compare. I always said that the spread is actually the crucial one for the crucial factor that says how much lending or borrowing might happen on secondary platform. If there's less spread, you should see less competitiveness from secondary lenders. And if you again see the black line, so we chose the ratio between secondary loans on secondary platforms versus loans on MakerDAO, actually total supply of MakerDAO, you can see the ratio is really low, and it really shows that MakerDAO actually is dominating currently. The third insight, this is what I was pretty much talking about last week. I just updated. So this represents the sample of top 100 single collateral DAI CDPs, which represent almost 90% of the debt. Nothing changed? Nothing. Yeah, actually, only one thing changed. The thing that I mentioned at the beginning, the share of debt increasing. So share of CDPs who are still minting DAI, it decreased because one large CDP closed its position. Otherwise, everything stayed pretty much the same. The debt represented by CDPs who were totally inactive during this migration period is still almost half of the debt. And again, we need to monitor this going forward, especially now since SAI stability fee is at 9%. So we might see some more motivation from CDPs to migrate, and we should be seeing what every one of those CDPs from each category is actually doing or will be doing. SAI liquidity, I mentioned this a couple of times that it's really low. This is data borrowed from Alitio. There's only 250,000 SAI traded per day on average, and mostly just on two platforms, Uniswap and Kyber. Uniswap liquidity for SAI is 3 times as lower than for DAI. And I think this is actually becoming a serious problem for some of the remaining LCDs who want to deleverage. If there's not enough SAI liquidity in migration contract, or if markets become even more shallow than they are now, and this can be particularly problematic when Ether price is crashing, right? When those CDPs want to, increase the collateralization ratio, but they cannot do anything if they don't get SAI immediately. So we'll see how this develops. Another thing was trying to compare a bit how DAI in DSR, DAI that gets locked into DSR, how it responds to DSR rate, try to find some correlations. I didn't run any statistics so far, but just from the graph here, you could see that DAI locked in DSR looks pretty linear. There is one notable increase here in the middle of December. That was when Compound implemented DSR. So all of the unutilized DAI just switched to DSR. And at the beginning of the December, when the rate was increased from 2 to 4%, you could also see a bit of spike in DAI in DSR. Although at that time, if I remember, most of the trading venues were also migrating DAI. So it's not, you shouldn't really, hard to say about correlation here. Was it because of the rate or because of the migration? And then the last increase from 4 to 6, still the same pace of DAI being locked in DSR until the last week when we saw a bit of outflow. But it was one larger outflow. I'm not sure why it happened. Could also potentially be that, some users are just migrating, actually switching from DAI to Ether because there was a bit of bullish sentiment, or maybe just some other reason. I also checked comparative with utilization. That's because I noticed that there was a lot of DAI minting since New Year. And of course, this also affects utilization, right? Because DSR utilization is DAI locked in DSR versus DAI supply. And because DAI supply was growing so massively, we can see the DSR utilization is actually back below 40%, where it was before the rate increase. So that's interesting to see. This DSR utilization should be always measured and taken into account when we decide for rate changes, either for stability fee or DSR. Some extra content that was not included in newsletter. Another metric might be useful for determining shutdown is analyzing the remaining SAI wallets, so not the CDPs, just the holders. And there's more than 1,000 wallets that hold more than 10 SAI and that were not active for more than a year. So these wallets represent 5.2 million SAI. That's about 20% of the supply. And the average inactivity, I weighted it by SAI value, is almost 18 months. So we have 5 million SAI held by addresses that haven't interacted for 18 months. and the top 10 inactive addresses hold more than 2 million Psi. I think the largest holder is 450,000 Psi. Yeah. Holds 450,000 Psi. It could be that some amount of that is lost, hard to tell, but something to keep an eye on in the future to see how these metrics develop. Migration flow. This was interesting to see how balance in migration contracts started to accumulate in the last couple of weeks. These are the yellow bars down there. The blue line shows how Psi migrated to migration contract. Again, a bit of increase here in the beginning of December when Coinbase and other venues migrated. It's not one-to-one with Psi supply, and that's because there was still a lot of Psi minted meanwhile, and was actually needed for the system to deleverage, because there was a lot of deleveraging going on, not just at MakerDAO, but also at secondary lending platforms. You can see this balance of migration contract, 6 million, that was, I don't know, 5 days ago, I think. And then the second largest CDP took it and migrated, actually close to its debt. And then the last metric, just trying to compare on-chain activity of DAI versus Psi historically. These are the daily active addresses. So DAI currently has about 2,000 daily active addresses, which is a bit below the long-term average, actually last 6 months average, but you shouldn't get distracted by these blue spikes for Psi, because this was, I believe, mostly due to Coinbase campaign, which enabled so much activity. And that's it from my end.
Awesome. That was really good.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Vishesh.
Okay, cool. If I run too many scripts, Chrome freaks out, so I had to reset everything. All right, so I'll try to go quick as well, because pretty much covers a decent amount. So skipping over some of the migration stuff for a sec. Yeah, so just with the 24-hour trading activity, DAI was, for a short time frame, trading very, very slightly below peg, which has kind of come up again very, very slightly. So we're talking about small deviations, and there's a lot of discussion in the Rocket chats, and I think on Twitter, about just how much it had deviated and whether that was significant enough to increase stability fee, which people will then go ahead and act on anyway. So we've seen those fee changes come through, but they were very small, in the grand scheme of things in terms of the overall price deviation. And you can see here at the end of the day, though there are moments where, and if you look at the larger timescale, there will always be moments in Psi, DAI, etc., where you'll have a short run up or a short run down in price. But I think taking that slightly longer timescale views is usually a good lens to look at. And a lot of times those kind of short dips can be driven by trading activity more than stability fees. And I think this is not a new discussion around what's the role of monetary policy levers and the impact on the price versus the price having its own sort of externally market-driven fluctuations, and then us kind of thinking and triangulating that those fee changes are causing those price changes. And so that's, again, probably a thread to revisit in a more statistically driven numerical context. So either that happens on these calls or offline in written form. That's probably a good discussion topic as well. So yeah, but long story short, DAI volume weighted average price pretty much at peg, very, very, very slightly below. Middling amount of trading volume for the last 24 hours. Psi trading volume is, as Primoz alluded to, slightly lower than it had been, and then globally, obviously, it's very, very low. And the volume weighted average price is shockingly pretty close to peg, despite the drying up of liquidity. And that's just something to touch on as well real quick is Uniswap, DAI, Maker, and Sai liquidity. So DAI liquidity, really only about 2.8 million. So I would say globally speaking, compared to the total DAI supply that's out there and compared to what you might see for some other assets, pretty low. And then the Uniswap trading volume is on the lower end compared to some of the other places where DAI trades. So that's also something to consider, is how much of the trading is happening on places like Uniswap where there is that like liquidity pool versus Oasis and DYDX. And DYDX has really, I think, since MCD launch and since the last month or so, picked up in the share of DAI trading that happens there. But yeah, so Sai liquidity even lower, though surprisingly the multiple for DAI to Sai liquidity is fairly small compared to the total amount of DAI being traded versus Sai. So that's interesting, is those two assets are closer in trading activity and liquidity on Uniswap than they are globally. So Uniswap is the great equalizer. MKR liquidity is also just a topic that I like to touch on and remind people of. So there's a lot of interesting things to keep an eye on in terms of how much MKR is out there, how much MKR market making activity is out there. And this is a topic that will probably be more relevant, I think, as we start to talk about more risk-oriented stuff and what happens in the event of auctions and what's, the various appetites for printing MKR and selling it off, and what would price impacts be versus, MKR burn and projected revenues and stuff like that. I think that's a really interesting topic area that is sort of under talked about. So probably just something to put on people's radars. Yeah, so in the longer time scale though, so 7 days DAI trading activity pretty solid at like 25, 26 million. And then again, the average for that 7-day period is just very, very slightly below peg. One other thing to touch on was just, I was looking at the, collateral and debt. So hopefully I got 2 graphs here. We'll start to add more back as we go for tracking just the total amount of collateral over time for MCD vaults, and looking at when major changes in collateral and debt happen. So these pretty much track with each other very well. So people are managing that risk somewhat efficiently. So this is interesting to look at because—
What are these two charts? What's the difference between—
Yeah, so the first chart is the collateral, the amount of ETH locked as collateral. And then the second chart is the amount of ETH DAI that's been issued for MCD. And then the green spikes are increases and the red spikes are decreases. So this is basically coming back to a corollary of what we used to look at for draws and wipes. Since MCD vaults work slightly differently, they're not really exactly draws and wipes anymore, but I've basically just started segmenting out which transactions are increases in debt and collateral versus decreases in debt and collateral. I'm trying to show those spikes, so we have like a frame of comparison that we understand from the SCD days. So yeah, I was just sort of looking at how the amount of debt and collateral fluctuates over time. I'll go ahead and pull ETH prices next time so we can do this as collateralization ratios over time. But yeah, the big spikes, so it's interesting, large quantity of collateral added and removed on the 16th, and then some collateral added on the 18th. large quantity of debt added and removed on the 16th, and then large quantity of debt added on the 18th. So that's interesting. That's interesting, and that's sort of what translates into the rate of growth of this line. So conversely, you can put it in context of size supply. So that DAI supply has been sort of consistently increasing since migration, and the size supply has been consistently decreasing despite certain like bumps that Primoz talked about last time. And yeah, so the net is that the DAI plus size supply has been consistently increasing, which is interesting because that shows that the DAI supply has been increasing faster than the size supply has been decreasing, which ultimately translates into, you could argue, like an increase in usage or demand, depending on how we want to think about that, and think about that in the context of the amount locked up in the DSR and how we want to treat, in terms of supply and demand calculations, the amount that's sitting in the DSR contract. So we could sort of next time also net this out with the amount that's in the DSR, which is similar to the graph that Primoz showed. Yeah, so, and then again, just briefly touching on secondary lending markets. So we've seen this kind of consistent drain in the amount of gross borrow for SAI. I think there was a slight uptick in the amount of supply, but at least the gross borrow has come down to a pretty low amount on compound, which has kind of resulted in this borrow APR first coming down, but then now I think has come up a bit as well. So it's theoretically becoming less and less profitable to borrow and lend using SAI, and more attractive to do so using DAI. And then, you know, with the increase in the DSR rate, it will be interesting to see the impact on these rates as well. But I mean, all in all, that is nothing too interesting, but seems to be kind of what you would want to see from a migration process, and things do seem to be proceeding in the right direction, at least based on the numbers.
Really quickly, Michael Newman mentioned something interesting is that Compound actually removed SAI from their app interface, so you could still see it in the markets and everything. But
yeah, I assume that's if you're not already actively borrowing it, it's not there as a new choice to pick.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, as we've seen many times with crypto, UI plays a huge role in what happens in the markets. Sometimes surprisingly outsized role. Gotta love awkward silences.
All right, thanks. That was really good. Nice job, guys. I guess we can open it up for Q&A discussion at this point. Certainly a lot to talk about. Do you guys have any thoughts on SAI liquidity as it relates to potentially thinking about emergency shutdown for SAI? Because I think both of you guys mentioned in your presentations that SAI liquidity has been dropping, like such as the Uniswap volume and so on. Any thoughts on when it reaches some sort of danger level where it's no longer safe? I mean, can we even figure out a certain point when CDP owners it's basically near impossible for them to migrate over?
No, I
in
think,
terms of, go for it.
okay. I think it's always going to be possible. It's just a matter of price. So I think there's always going to be some market makers who will issue SAI, but then the thing is they might just charge more than in the future than now, right? Especially now because SAI stability fee is going to be 9%. Right. And those guys, knowing that they might wait a few months, so perhaps they will charge extra % for selling that DAI. So it's more a question of a price than, you know, not being able to get out, I guess.
So what's a reasonable price then? I mean, yeah, because this stability fee going up kind of, I mean, I guess it kind of somewhat forces it limits the options for sure, in terms of liquidity. So,
I mean, I guess it depends, right, on a question of what's your goal. So if the goal is to, you know, protect users from being exposed to a certain price impact, like, I'm not sure if forcing migration will ever really necessarily protect them from that. So yeah, I mean, to just eliminate extra overhead in managing the system is, from my vantage point, like the only goal that I could see here in terms of forcing shutdown. So in that sense, like,
yeah,
my guess is going to be that liquidity and trading volume, like, though there have been very slight decreases, I mean, it's more or less leveling out to like some kind of bottom, like, level steady state. And I imagine that would persist and wouldn't drop significantly further. So in that sense,
there was always this implicit context that governance would protect users from these big price movements. Because I guess the line of reasoning was that if the price were to jump to like 105, for example, then potentially in like an emergency, global settlement would be called, right? So governance was trying to do what they could to prevent a situation like that from happening. But now if we take the perspective that just whatever happens is fine and our goal is just to minimize overhead, then what's going to happen if the peg does deviate?
So just a quick one. I think we need to focus on, you know, when Ether is crashing, that's the time when people really want to buy SAI, and especially CDPs who want to deleverage. So we need to see what's going to happen on those occasions. We usually saw a spike in SAI and DAI both, but now with SAI liquidity being really drained, the spike might be even higher. So we'll see how it goes. But I'm afraid those events might cause, you know, SAI trading much above 1.
Right. In like November, when we saw that the price would spike to like $1.03, $1.04, right? Could easily be much higher now.
Yeah.
So one thing I was going to say is potentially we should have a signal poll for whether we should shut down based on liquidity rather than like directly like the peg deviation. Because in an ideal circumstance, right, we'd shut down before the peg deviates and people get screwed. So yeah.
Well, I guess that's kind of my point, is liquidity is so low at this stage that you're kind of in that risk area and you're sort of waiting for a price event in ETH that causes a negative outcome for people that are going to be trading SAI. And so that's kind of where you're at. And I just, based on the numbers, I don't imagine that liquidity drying up significantly further. It's already very low. So I don't know, setting a like low bar of the total trading volume or the total amount in a Uniswap pool, for example, might not actually protect you from the outcome you're trying to manage against.
Okay, so you're saying you think we're basically already at the point where if we were going to shut down on low liquidity, we should shut down on low liquidity.
At this point, I don't think an additional 10% drop in liquidity is like super likely to happen in like the next couple of weeks, or B, going to make a huge difference in the price impact in the event that something significant happens with ETH overnight. I think that's just going to be the primary driving factor, is when is there a crash or a run up in ETH?
Yeah, okay.
So another thing with these like shutdown scenarios, are these assuming that we're going to implement some sort of taxation to ding the CDP holders who stay through, or are we just forgiving the stability fees in this situation?
Yep. So looks like there's at least three things we need to figure out. One is, what is the decision mechanism for the community agreeing to implement an emergency shutdown? One is the lag time from when that decision is made to the actual hard date. And then third is kind of the technical implementation of it. Presumably the technical implementation should be ironed out perfectly before the community decides on starting the process. Probably a few other things to figure out too, but yeah, I mean, Sam, I think the tax, I mean, one way or another, it just has to be figured out.
Figures it out. Who does the onus lie on?
I think it's maybe like a signal request, or I guess just, I mean, at what point there's already a thread, right? On.
Yeah, so I mean, Aaron's been helming like the SCD shutdown threads so far. So potentially I would encourage Aaron to make one based on tax, unless he's unable to for some reason. Yeah, okay, so he said he will do in the chat. So yeah, I guess we'll look forward to that.
Do we have an update on anything regarding the tax implementation?
I would love to hear like a summary of the whole thing, because in reading it, it's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around the whole idea. But I do really like Nick's perspective. He understand.
Yeah, I don't think any decisions have been made so far regarding it, but I think we're still kind of trying to wrap our heads around it and maybe see like a technical proposal to start.
I mean, look, I could jump in for like a minute or two and just kind of explain how it would work if that helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would help. But additionally, I do want to make sure that there is like that maybe you or Derek can put together like a written thing as well that we can share in the chats and the forums, because as far as I know, there isn't like a very clear written proposal on how everything would work. Yeah, Derek's forum post is based on a really tiny mini post I did on Rocket Chat. So I'll give like a quick 1 minute, 2 minute rundown, and then maybe we can put something more substantial together for next week's governance call. So essentially, what's happening technically is that there is another fee parameter called tax that you can levy on CDPs. It works similarly to the stability fee with one difference. The stability fee does not accrue on the debt of a CDP, while the tax parameter does. And so the difference there being that the whole reason we're in this situation is because people can just keep their CDPs open indefinitely, right? And they'll never get liquidated because the stability fee doesn't get added onto their debt, versus on the tax side would. The other difference is that during global settlement, the debt is used, right? And so the reason that stability fees are forgiven during a global settlement is because they haven't accrued on the debt. That's not the case for tax. Now, from a game theory perspective, once you turn on tax, it is completely suboptimal for anyone to pay back their CDP, right? Because not only would you be paying the accrued stability fees that you've amassed, but you'd also be paying this additional tax, for whatever period of time it's been running. So really, the only two times any kind of fee will be paid is either before you implement the tax, or during global settlement, where someone has resigned themselves to just paying tax and not paying the stability fees. So what I want to emphasize is that this is not a technical issue. This is really a comms issue. You need to effectively say, hey, this is tax. This is what it does.
and this is the date that it's going to happen, and you have to be very, very loud about that. So everyone who is, banking on not paying their stability fees realizes the context, right, the game theoretic situation that they're in, and will pay back their stability fees. Now,
Yeah,
right?
actually, can I ask you a question, Nick? Unless
Sure.
you're about to make some earth-shattering point, I don't want to interrupt you, but I'm trying to wrap my head around how, I don't know if it's equitable, maybe not accurate. So I'm a large holder. I have 50,000 in fees, and a tax. The community moves forward with the tax. Is the tax designed to somehow reach parity with what my fee would have been by the time a shutdown happens? What happens to a large holder versus, or somebody with $10,000 in fees and somebody with $1,000 in fees? Are they taxed proportionately, or is this feels like a really big stick, or is it more targeted than I'm imagining?
It is a very big stick. It is not a. There's a slight. Here's what you have to do, right? If you make sure that the tax ends up becoming equivalent to the stability fees, then there's still no incentive for anyone to bother paying their stability fees, right? Because then it's like, I may as well just pay the tax, whatever, right? And then
yeah, that's the part that I keep on getting jammed up on, right?
Exactly.
I'm not seeing why this would work.
Right, and then you don't have the supply crunch from Psi, right? With people paying, over $1 trying to obtain Psi to close their positions, right? So in order to make tax effective, you really have to make sure you hammer it down, for lack of a better term, to be more than the stability fees. The other thing here is that I want to bring up is that the period that tax is running, right? We just said that it's completely suboptimal for to pay back your stability fees after you've implemented the tax parameter, right? So this is not, you don't change it and then let it run for 2 months or a month or something. The period that tax runs can actually be very, very, very small, in my opinion, but maybe we should have some more discussion over that. Now, one thing, and you brought up this concept of fairness that I think is a little bit tricky here, is that CDPs were opened at very different points in time. So when you apply the tax parameter, right, that's not really going to be taken into account, and that's an issue. And so instead, what I feel like we should do is set the tax parameter based off of basically profiling the largest CDPs and how long they've been open, how much stability fees, unpaid stability fees they've accrued, and then set the tax parameter based off of whatever profile the majority of those fit.
Well, this is where the complexity is. Go ahead, sorry.
But again, I just want to ask one technical clarification. So just what you're saying is that if 2 CDPs are open, both with 10,000 DAI debt, one was opened a year ago and accrued massive stability fee, they would get charged the same tax because it accrues to the current debt?
That's correct. And so that's why I'm trying to say that this is a communications problem where you basically, the foundation has to say, this is phase 0 of global settlement. Everyone has to.
Actually, sorry, I have to stop you there, Nick. Let's be clear. It's not the foundation, though.
Okay.
The community needs to decide whether the community wants to do this, right?
So for the community plan for global settlement, I'd say this is how you communicate it. You say, this is phase 0 of global settlement, on this date. Let's say, I'm just randomly throwing it out there, but March 31st, this is when global settlement starts. And phase 0 of global settlement is that you implement tax. and you have to be, right, like I said before, you have to be super, super loud and definitive about this, that this is the day, like it is in your best interest to, pay back fees before this day. Because after that, right, then you implement tax, and then shortly after you implement tax, right, then you actually trigger the emergency shutdown module.
I think it's going to be critically important that the community has this discussion to figure out what their ultimate goal is. Is it to claw back these fees? Is it to incentivize migration? Is it to turn up the fire under 3 large holders and then accept the collateral damage of everybody else who happen to be bystanders, or is it to reach some kind of equitable parity?
There's one other thing that needs to be taken into account, is the fact that the tax that is paid, it does not go to MKR holders. It doesn't go to that pool. It actually goes to PETH holders. And ironically, since the largest PETH holders are the largest CDP owners, there's a very real, amount that you get back from the amount that you actually pay in tax. So when we're
enormously complex, right?
Yeah. So when we're thinking about what we want tax to accumulate to, you have to take into account that reimbursement as well.
Yeah, it's an issue that needs to be addressed as well. So it's this tax, is the worst conceivable name for it, but so this parameter is essentially being implemented with this understanding that MKR holders need to be compensated for the risks that they took managing the system, blah, blah, blah. But that's not actually the case, because this is SCD, right? That they didn't, that it was the PETH holders, right? So go ahead, Cyrus.
Well, sorry, so the tax goes to PETH holders.
Yeah.
So does it benefit? So just to be clear, it does not benefit the MKR holders directly?
It does not benefit MKR.
Does it indirectly benefit them in other ways?
No, it doesn't. So as an MKR holder, your incentives are to, which as most people in governance, I would assume are, their incentive is to pressure people to pay back their debt before the tax parameter, because anyone who pays back after tax is implemented, it's just a wash for MKR holders. So we kind of have to toe this line between, we have this big stick, we're incentivized to use it, but we should wield it responsibly to not piss off a lot of people, right?
There's some very complicated.
Can I comment here quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned this is a common spot issue, which I kind of agree with, but I don't think. So the argument is that we have to. If anyone gets hit by tax, that's bad because it's going to be huge. So we want to get everyone to close their CDP before tax hits, right? That's essentially the argument, right? Cool. So the question is, can we do we think we're going to hit 100% of CDP holders with this comms outpouring of messages and blog posts and stuff?
No.
Well, it feels like a rhetorical question because I think
Yeah, it is, right? So this is the thing. If we can't hit 100% of people, then we shouldn't apply a non-proportional tax to any percentage of those people, right?
Primoz keeps on pointing out the fact that there's a significant possibility that these people are just gone or checked out or don't care, or there's a vast amount of people left over from Coinbase Earn that are just never going to migrate because they don't understand how crypto works anyways, right? So
I have a question, Nick. So if when the tax hits, then a CDP owner gets back less collateral, does that mean DAI holders get more than the dollar's worth? Would this create any incentives on just holding outright DAI because you might end up getting a larger share of the collateral?
No, right? DAI holders are just entitled to $1 worth of collateral. It's the PETH owners who actually win out and get back more ETH per PETH.
Right.
Okay. Effectively, it's the PETH that is collected for tax, right, is burned.
Right.
So then so you lose, as a CDP owner, you lose a good chunk of your PETH, but the PETH that you do keep, the ratio to ETH now has increased substantially. So you get a lot more ETH back on your path. Not as much as you owed in tax, but a good chunk.
If you get that back,
But
does that not like defeat the game theory of like of having like wanting to avoid paying the tax at all costs because you get some of it back in like path?
Not if you set the tax high enough.
I mean,
Right.
the tax all goes to path holders, right? So like, it doesn't matter. It's not about the absolute value. It's like the proportion.
You
Isn't it?
just get a reimbursement though. It's not like I just have to look at the highest CDP holder, right? For example, see how much PETH he has in the CDP and understand what his share of the total PETH pool is, and you could pretty much calculate how much ETH he's gonna be reimbursed.
So going for what you said, LongForWisdom, I don't think you'll ever get 100% participation in this. But I do realize that right, it's more of an 80-20 type of rule here where the amount of very, very large CDPs with unpaid stability fees is quite a small number, right? So trying to profile their situation and tailoring tax towards them, I think is kind of what we should be aiming for here.
Maybe, I mean, this is the thing, like, so the people who have larger CDPs, obviously they presumably have a larger amount of assets, right? Like so even if it hits like smaller CDP, if we get all like the large CDPs to migrate, but like 20% of the smaller ones don't, that still hits them like proportionally compared to their assets, that still hits them the same large, right? Like the absolute value is lower, but proportionally, assuming their assets is roughly,
yeah,
you know what I mean.
I mean, I hate to keep talking in circles, but it really is a comms issue where the date that you set tax, like you have to advertise that date as this is the last day to pay back your. It's not, but really it is.
Wouldn't that cause like I mean, that could be bad for Psi liquidity, right? If everybody's, because if the tax is going to be so onerous that we're trying to get people to pay back before the date, then
everyone's going to be trying to run out the door, right? But the alternative is that we have the current situation, right, where you're not going to have any of the large holders even attempt to pay back any of their fees.
Do we care at this point? Like open question?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you can open up a CDP position today then and get 0% interest rate until we shut down then, if we don't do anything.
So we should reduce the debt ceiling to 0 to prevent like more Psi being minted. But like,
yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that part of the conversation because, yeah, a debt ceiling of 0, a stability fee of 0, and no shutdown date is an interesting.
Right. So just mint a bunch of Psi. You know you'll never have to pay your fee. Migrate it to DAI and collect DSR. It's free money otherwise.
Right.
Yeah. So you have to set the debt ceiling to 0. Is that? Oh no, you're saying right. Yeah. So that's why you can't keep it open forever because they'll just collect DSR and not pay any fees. Right. I understand.
Exactly. So right now we have 2,137,405 accrued stability fees on Psi. I'll post that in the chat.
We could also shut down the migration contract so you can't move Psi to DAI when we do the zeros on single collateral DAI to prevent the earning DSR unless they're already there. But
sounds like it could be an option.
Has there been any thought given to like just setting the liquidation ratio to like a really high number to force liquidate all the positions?
Sorry, say that again.
Has there been any thought given to just setting the liquidation ratio to like a super high number to force liquidate all the positions? Is that an option?
Not really, because stability fees are also forgiven on liquidation.
Right, but I mean, as a penalty instead of the tax.
Yeah, but you're shorting MKR. You're basically taking away that from MKR holders and you're giving it to PETH holders in doing that. Because then the liquidation penalties would all go to PETH holders.
And
so,
for the largest CDPs that have accrued the most stability fees, what they owe is much larger than 13%.
Okay. Is it similar to the tax mechanism?
It is not, but it effectively it can be wielded in the same way.
Okay.
Two questions. One, Nick, sorry, I'm still not understanding the distribution aspect to it. So let's say the tax, it charges some amount to all PETH holders, but then it just distributes that back to the same PETH holders, but you're saying in a lower ratio or in a different proportion. So what I'm saying, does it kind of redistribute an even amount, or is there some portion that's taken out and sent somewhere else or used for something else to actually implement a penalty?
That's a good question. I need to think about it some more. What the exact proportion is.
And then,
I can probably come up with some kind of equation.
So regarding the returns on PETH, so wouldn't it be the case that basically people with ETH sitting around would then pile it into PETH the moment before this tax is applied, and like completely dilute the pool?
Yeah,
possible, but it's a matter of like, letting people know, and there's also kind of other weird things about it.
But this is the thing, if we like have to be super loud on the comms to announce this ahead of time. So as soon as people realize that they can just make money on PETH, because that's where the tax is going, they're like going to do that, right?
I mean, that would actually help though, to an extent, right? Because from a game theory point of view, if you're trying to incentivize people to pay back their CDPs before tax is implemented, if they're banking on getting back some proportion of their ETH through the PETH reimbursement factor, and now everyone piles in on PETH, right? That makes their situation worse. So
yeah,
I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I just see it as kind of a.
So I'll explain why I think that's a bad thing, and it's because it comes back to the whole, we're not going to hit 100% of CDP holders with this messaging, and some of them are going to get like screwed by this tax, right?
I mean, but the whole thing is that we made a good faith effort to reach as many as we possibly could, because at the end of the day, no matter what, somebody's going to get kind of financially screwed from not paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Maybe we are okay with like saying you weren't paying attention, so tough luck to you. But like, my argument is that we should not do that.
You're never going to get 100% of CDP users.
Right. I don't think comms is the right word. I think this is more like a business decision, like from a kind of keeping your users, like kind of deciding what kind of a relationship the community wants to have with the broader user base.
Maybe there's some lower bound on the stability fees owed that we would be willing to forgive.
I agree that so I think that's a great perspective to take. And I think the other thing too is I'm hearing options to solve a problem. I'm not sure that everybody's talking about the same problem. So that's something that could be explored as well. Is the idea that we need to have people migrate? Is it because the community wants those fees back? Is it because the community wants to burn MKR? Is it because the community doesn't want people to pile into Psi as the operational overhead of that ecosystem becomes too high? I think that clarifying what the goal is might be useful before we start casting around for different solutions.
Maybe the goal can be summarized in the effective winding down and deprecation of single collateral DAI, right? And so to do that, you need to make sure that people are leaving Psi rather than piling in. And so from a game theory perspective, you have to solve the fee issue, right? Because if you're getting away with the fees, and it's very clear that you might be getting away with the fees, then why would you ever root somebody?
Well, yeah, that's the thing that I'm coming back to, is that there's a certain level of sour grapes, right? Like nobody wants to see somebody else get off scot-free when we've all been paying our fees diligently. But there's also, we don't want to encourage people to game the existing system that we're trying to shut down. We also want to ensure that the system kind of hews closely to the design that it was set up for originally. So we really need to figure out what it is we hope to achieve and then work backwards from there, as opposed to trying to figure out how to squeeze people and whether the stick using it to do it is big enough or not big enough. I think it's complicated. Vishesh, did you say something? Want to add something?
No, I mean, I was just saying earlier.
The only goal that you can see is what?
I was just saying earlier that was the point, was what is the point of what you're trying to do? What's the goal here? And like, my point earlier was, if the goal is to protect against, you know, some kind of potential peg deviation in DAI, to protect DAI holders from, you know, price events, or sorry, I mean size specifically, then I don't know if you're necessarily solving that problem with, you know, having like liquidity cutoff, et cetera, for, you know, forcing migration. But if now we're sort of talking about a different point of, if your goal is to prevent people from getting off scot-free for trying to cleverly work around paying fees, that's a different goal. And now you're talking about a slightly different problem. So I 100% agree with you that it's important to define what are you doing and why are you doing it. But at this point, like, unless, you know, somebody has a different idea, the only thing that I've heard that makes sense is the reason for forcing like a migration switchover is the operational overhead.
Yeah, I think that we're probably on the same page. So let's figure out why this thing is going to happen. And then I guess my second concern here is modeling out the potential implications of each one of these decisions, right? That it's not going to be a simple thing. You try to squeeze one side of this ecosystem, it's very, very difficult to predict the impact that it has on other areas. So I can offer nothing more than this needs to be very, very closely examined. And I think it needs to move past the opinion stage and more into like, this is the literal hopeful, this is the outcomes that the community is looking to achieve, and here's the mechanical way in which we go about doing that, and then also here's the potential implications of like going off the rails or not. I think it needs to be formalized as much as possible.
Rich, to that point, Primoz, last week you shared an Excel spreadsheet that was had the top 100 CDPs and a breakdown. It included the accrued fees, percentages of fees and debt. Would it be possible to have an updated spreadsheet? Because what I started looking at last week was what you had there, and then trying to illustrate tax at hypothetically day 1, day 2 as a percentage of accrued interest, and what that would look like across the CDPs, and trying to come up with you know, a potential approach. But if I could have an updated spreadsheet from you, then I can probably get with Nick and Cyrus and others to put something up on the forum as a here's some approach. I'm not sure if that should precede a poll to your question along for wisdom earlier. But
I'd like to expand the scope of that a bit too, because it's not a foundation effort. Like I said earlier, it's a community effort as well, right? So we should probably put out a call to see if people who have some deep thoughts about this mechanism want to join in on those discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to put it as a Google Doc once we get to it. My only question there is, I'm not sure if it should be after a poll that says we absolutely do want to enforce this parameter.
Well, no, the cart and horse situation, right? Like, so agreeing that we all have this sense of urgency and something has to be done. I'm not sure that that's the case yet. So some exploration and some like formalization, like let's aggregate all of the thoughts that people have into a doc, and we can start debating, and then pull us before we know what it is that the ecosystem wants to do. I think can set us down a path that we might not have wanted to be on in the first place.
Derek, to your question, I'll update the file and also include the rest of CDP, so not just the top 100 ones.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, I feel like you guys are just trolling me at this point. So we've had very interesting discussion. I don't want to lose the thread here. So Derek and Co will be coordinating some kind of a doc with Primoz, and we'll bring whatever resources the foundation can bring to this conversation. But I'm intensely interested that it's ultimately, this is the community's decision, and it's a big decision. And so I'd love to see the community get involved and make themselves heard. So if you have some thoughts about this, reach out to Derek, and then he'll help you get something coordinated. I think that's going to be it for today. It's 30 minutes into the Q&A session, so let's wrap it up. Thanks everybody for the fascinating discussions, some weighty decisions ahead of us. So thanks for the call. All right, bye-bye.